Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Lunch and Learn webinar from your Northern BC Community of Practice. If you're new in the room, the COP is a group of organizations and individuals whose purpose is to improve restoration, efficacy, and capacity through improved knowledge sharing, including through webinars like this. We're guided by an organizing team with core members from CERN BC, the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, the Caribou Habitat Restoration Fund via HCTF, and the BC Wildlife Federation. This webinar is going to be recorded in its entirety, and you'll be able to watch it later on CERN BC's YouTube channel. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Kelsey and Eric Neilson from the Canadian Forest Service, and they are going to tell us about forests, the Forest Ecosystem Simulator, and potentially its applications for environmental management. Take it away.
All right. Hi. Thanks for the introduction, May. Kelsey, can you just give me a thumbs up to make sure you can hear me?
We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks again. So what Kelsey and I are going to be talking about is this model that we want to get ready to do some analysis about trade-offs related to management in forestry. And I'll go through a couple of the sort of context of of those objectives. But basically, it's just a way to ask about big landscape processes that are involved in different management decisions. So yeah, next slide. So the first thing we're interested in is wildfire. So this slide is a map of Canada showing some work by colleagues of ours here at the Northern Forestry Centre in Edmonton. And it's just a map of the 2023 fire season, which was this absolutely catastrophic year that really highlights the changes that are occurring in the wildfire regime. So 15 million hectares across Canada, 2 million hectares in Alberta alone. And it was just indicative of the massive changes that are coming and requiring new management approaches. And next slide. So just a quick comment to say that the regime is changing with climate change. So here on the top two graphs show a couple climate values, vapor pressure deficit and precipitation, which are just showing that over time we're getting drier and hotter conditions, and that's leading to larger, higher areas of burn over this fire seasons, and the severity. So there's an increase in the damage done by these big fires. Next slide. So one way that we could potentially consider managing wildfire is with harvest. So forest companies are sort of in the business of changing the composition and age of forest stands, and that will of course have effect on wildfire fuels. And so here's just a quick graph showing that in areas of fire break cutting where there was some thinning or removal of fuels, you get a difference in the crown volume charred inside those cut blocks or those cut fire breaks. So there's some rationale to think that harvest is a approach we can use to manage wildfire. Next slide. Here's another slide just showing the change in a couple of different metrics, including probability of mortality, the average bull char height, the crown volume consumed, and the percent crown volume affected, increasing with the amount of fuel that you have in either the crown or the surface. So doing something about removing fuels in an active, prescribed way is a opportunity that is of interest to the forest sector. But now we can kind of get to the crux of what Kelsey and I want to talk about. We have these two processes, one that we can manage, the other that responds to it. And we want to know what kind of moves to make in order to make positive changes. But there are other values out there on the landscape. So the one that we're going to highlight, if you go to the next slide, is caribou. Now, there are a whole series of different values out on the landscape, and in Alberta especially, there are a lot of values in our working landscapes, but Kelsey and I are focused on these woodland caribou, southern mountain population. So on the left is a map of the southern mountain group of caribou that was assessed as threatened in 2003 by Environment Canada. And just a very brief primer, I imagine a lot of folks on the call are familiar with this. If you're younger or more open, you get different ungulates populations increasing, so that in the mountains typically means things like elk, moose, and mule deer. As those increase, you get more predators, and the caribou, who tend to live in less productive areas, older places, places with deeper snow, arboreal lichen, and so on, are not able to manage that predation pressure that increases. So that means that forest harvest, which, as I commented a minute ago, reduces the age, changes the composition of the forest. It is actually a negative effect for caribou. So we're not able to do that harvest for free. There are going to be consequences for other forest values. So next slide. Caribou, as I say, are living in these older forests with terrestrial lichen on the ground. But the other approach that we need to think about here is that wildfire also affects caribou habitat. So if you click forward again, we can see that the lichen, and this is a little bit more of a boreal data set, but the principle is the same, where we're getting lower lichen at young ages after fire. And that means that we can't really just, if the fire regime changes such that a lot of areas caribou use are disturbed, then that's no good either. So there's a need to really kind of trade off amongst these three different players: fire, caribou, and harvest. Next slide. Just another slide to show that over time we're expecting this is actually a map of a forest management area in northeastern Alberta, which is very boreal. But the point here is that climate model predictions are suggesting that there will be less and less caribou habitat over time as the fire regime continues to change. Next slide, please. So, well, you might ask, well, which one is worse? What's the actual sweet spot here? And there's some new emerging work on this by colleagues of ours at Foothills Research Institute, which is really neat. So these four graphs basically show, if you look at the top borders, you'll see that there's four different subregions: the Central Mixedwood, the Foothills, the Lower Boreal Highlands, and the Upper Boreal Highlands. The green and red graphs are the interesting things. Those are how the changes in caribou lichen, moose saplings, moose shrubs, bear shrubs are changing with time in either a cuplock or a wildfire. And you see that in some cases, and sort of in a compellingly larger amount of cases, you get closer to caribou habitat more quickly after a fire. More caribou lichens and fewer forage species for the other players, which are the competitors. All right, so I'm going to finish with my preamble in a minute here. We have these three different processes on the landscape. What can we do to try to assess what to do? So if you go forward one more slide, we can talk about these things called the vulnerability assessments, which provide estimates of risk associated with management alternatives and provide decision insights for trade-offs amongst these values. Vulnerability assessments are focused on risk, which is looking at how severe a disturbance may be with respect to how valuable it is. And so we're able to use this kind of framework to plug in all of our different processes. Wildfire is the hazard, the force values may be habitat, timber supply, and so on. So just a quick example of a possible scenario, if you go forward again. For caribou, we're trying to think about ways to reduce that habitat for those wolves and those other players. So that means restoring, creating, connecting, protecting caribou habitat. But because of the complexity of these processes, it's not clear where and how much to try to do that sort of thing. So for example, if you go forward again, you can imagine an area where you have a lot of caribou and the gray blobs on the left are cut blocks. If you proceed with harvest in a certain way, you're going to remove habitat for caribou. So Kelsey, maybe I'll just get you to toggle forward. You could create a big protected area in the north of the area where caribou are relegated to as you harvest in the south. But then you may be looking at loss of that area due to the natural disturbances. So we need a way to get a handle on all of these different things. And I'm going to flip over to Kelsey now. But yeah, really what we need to do is build tools that allow us to kind of get a handle on these different processes.
Yeah, so given that need for tools, we kind of had two main objectives. The first thing we wanted to do was to develop a simulation system that integrates forest succession with natural and human disturbance to allow us to project the future fire regime, as well as forest structure and composition, and then also to assess the vulnerability of these harvest planning scenarios to various climate change scenarios. So Forest is composed of a bunch of different modules and a bunch of different processes. The main three you can see on the upper left there, which correspond to the color-coded arrows. So the first of which is harvest, which will remove the trees that are there and involves replanting. The second of which is fire, and you can have crown fires or surface fires. And the last of which is succession, which is how you go from immature to mature trees, as well as represent processes like serotiny. Each of these I'm going to go a little bit more into in the next couple slides here. So starting with harvest, the harvest prescription is what determines what time step a cell is harvested. So the user inputs a harvest prescription layer telling the model if a cell is harvested and if it is harvested, when it's harvested. When that happens, all cohorts, all species, like trees on that cell are going to be harvested and 1-year-old lodgepole gets replanted. So for example, if you look on the right here, this represents lodgepole biomass, where lighter means more biomass. So if we start out pre-harvest, we have lodgepole there. When it gets harvested, there is now no lodgepole anymore, and then it gets replanted with young lodgepole. And so you'll see that some of that biomass coming back. When it comes to succession, this is something that's controlled by a program called Landis, and it runs in a 5-year time step. That can be varied depending on the user. If there's a different time step wanted, for our project, we used 5 years. The things that you need to give Landis as inputs, for each cell, it needs to know what cohorts are present and how old those cohorts are, as well as some information like weather. So those initial cohorts and ages for us are based on the Alberta Vegetation Index, and then future time steps, all of it is based on the outputs of the previous Landis time step. So it aged at 5 years in the year previous, and that's what we use as our starting point for the next 5 years. So as you can see on the right here, again, this is biomass, and like you'd expect, over time, you're getting more biomass, it's becoming lighter in color, and you also have some cells becoming, like getting more aspen biomass that didn't have aspen biomass before through processes like seeding. When it comes to the wildfire portion of the model, the first thing that we need to do is figure out how many fires we need to simulate. So this is an empirical model that we use because we know the number of fires and we have historical weather data, such as in our case, what we use is the mean monthly maximum temperature and the mean monthly precipitation. We can fit a model that gives us the number of fires as a function of these variables and calculate how many fires we're going to simulate for each year. Once we know how many fires we need to simulate, for each fire, there's a couple of steps that need to happen. The first thing that needs to happen is we need to update the fuel layer. This is a layer of FBP codes, or fire behavior prediction codes, and these need to be updated based on biomass, so based on the succession that happened in Landis, as well as previous fires. So an example of a layer like this is like you'd see on the right, where each cell is going to have its own fuel code. The fuel codes are represented numerically with the legend on the bottom there. And then what happens is when you have fires, which are represented by these black and red outlines here, you'll notice that the fuel codes inside of those change. This is because when a portion of the landscape burns, it's going to change what what species it's composed of, and what the structure is at that location. Once we've updated that fuel layer, we next need to select an ignition point, and we do this using a probability layer that's based on historic lightning density data. And this is going to be done through an acceptance rejection method. So it will pick a place, it picks a random number, it knows what the probability was for that cell, it picks a random number between 0 and 1. If it's below that value, it accepts it. If it's not, it picks another location, and it does that until it finds a location, and in that way we get more lightning strikes and happening in an area where there's a higher probability of lightning strikes happen, as the lightning strikes are the ignition source for the fires in our case. We then simulate the fires using Pandora, which runs Prometheus, and then after the fire has run, we have to remove the burned biomass based on fire intensity. After the fires have happened, this is going to trigger or potentially trigger serotiny. So serotiny is only triggered if the fire is intense enough to trigger serotiny. So if the cell is majority of it is composed of deciduous trees, serotiny will occur with any fire that happens. If the majority species is black spruce, serotiny will occur if the fire intensity is between 100 and 200. The reason black spruce is singled out is because it is semi-serotinous. If the majority is any conifer besides black spruce, serotiny will occur if it's over 100. The fire intensity is over 100. So what this means is that you have increased establishment of these serotinous species post-fire, and this will occur for one successional time step, so for 5 years. When biomass is removed because of a fire, the first thing that needs to happen is the cells need to be classified as either majority conifer, deciduous, or black spruce. We then need to classify the fire as either a surface burn or a crown burn. This is going to depend on whether that cell is majority conifer or black spruce, or whether it's majority deciduous. They will have different cutoffs to determine surface and crown fires, depending on what the majority species in that cell is. If it's a surface fire, all the trees that are under 5 meters are removed, but the mature and taller trees are left. If it's a crown fire, then all the trees are going to be removed, and there's not going to be any cohorts preserved. So from all these simulations, we get a couple of outputs. The first is we get the yearly fires. So from these, we can get the burned area, we can get the rate of spread, we can get the fire intensity. And it allows us to look at each year how many fires there are, what the average size is, and things like the number of fires allow us to compare on average between scenarios and with confidence intervals if there are some that might give you more or less fires, for instance. It also, the land portion of it, the succession portion, will give us things like the cohort age, the species, and the biomass for each cell. And from these, you can calculate things like caribou habitat quality or whatever your output of interest is. For us, for caribou habitat quality, what we did is we used a resource selection function. So this is done using GPS color data that had a 24-hour fix rate. And so we have used points that we know the caribou used because of the GPS color data, which on the right are in red. And then for each used point, we put 10 available points, which are the blue points. So this is a spot that the caribou could have used but didn't. And we fit one of these for early winter and late winter. And we do this using a logistic regression, which includes variables such as time since fire, age, whether deciduous is present or not, distance to water, and elevation. That will give us maps like you see here. So on the left, you can see the baseline caribou habitat quality. And because we're able to calculate these maps for each successional time step, we can see how this changes over time. So if you watch on the right, you'll see the difference in caribou habitat quality over time. So you'll see some areas are getting blue, they're getting better for the caribou. Some areas are getting red, they're getting worse for the caribou. You'll see some blotches of red showing up where there were some big fires, some individual cells, which could be something like harvest, and it allows us to really see how that is changing over time. FORS is also adaptable and flexible. We, in our case, use it for caribou, but the user can change the inputs for their question or for their area. So for instance, you can specify the random seeds. This just will lead to repeatability so that you can replicate your results if you need to, as opposed to it being defined for you. You can define the output folders and the main folder that it will be working in. You input your own weather because Landis and Pandora both need weather. You also will define the module inputs, so the control files, the communities that comprise the landscape that goes into Landis, as well as things like the harvest file and the area map. And then you also specify things related to time in the simulation. So the Landis time step, so for us it was a 5-year successional time step, that can be changed. The total amount of time the simulation runs. You also define the Pandora time step, with the only limit here being that the Landis time step has to be a multiple of the Pandora time step, and then also the year you want it to start. You can turn on and off some variables and processes here as well. You can decide whether or not you want harvest to be happening and whether or not you want surrounding to be happening in the simulation. Those are both optional. So with that in mind, I wanted to show you a quick demonstration of what FORS looks like. So I just have to switch over my screen here for 1 second, and then I will share my screen again. All right. All right, so this is what FORS looks like. It's run through Python, so this is going to look a little bit, it's a lot of code if you're not used to looking at a lot of code. But like I was saying before, this piece that you see that I'm highlighting on the left here, this is just where all your variables are defined. When when FORS, sorry, is running, you'll notice on the right here, when you set it to run, what's going to happen is it'll inform you of what's happening as it goes. So it'll tell you what random seed it's using. It'll tell you what Landis time step it's on and what year that is. It'll tell you that Landis is running. So this is when that succession is happening. It will have some starting processes to get up to define the landscape. And then once Landis is done running, it will inform you if it executed properly or if it did not execute properly, or it will inform you if it will retry one time to run it before it just tells you it failed. But if it does not execute properly, it will let you know that as well. So it is giving you feedback as you go. Once, in this case, it ran correctly. Once that is done running, then Pandora, it will move on to Pandora. This will take a little bit of time because now it has to convert the outputs of Landis into the fuel codes that Pandora will need. Pandora, when it is running, again, will tell you, it'll tell you how many fires and what fires it is on. I'm going to let that run in the background while Eric finishes the last little bit of the presentation, and then we'll come back to look at this when it is done so you can see it then. All right,
Thanks,
so
Kelsey.
Eric, if you...
Yeah, so it's really, thanks for getting that demo going, Kelsey. It's neat to be able to show this in action. As everyone on the call may imagine, there's quite a lot of coding and conversions to do to make these different processes speak to one another. We wanted to do one slide here to say what FORS does not do. And part of the reason for this is that folks may be familiar with a lot of similar kinds of applications that are asking in particular about wildfire modeling and behavior. So one example would be Burn P3 or Burn P3 Plus.
which is another program that uses Prometheus as an option for a fire growth behavior model. And you can see an example of some of the outputs from Burn P3 on this figure on the right. That's the kind of model where you basically would initialize a lot of fires. You sort of throw fires on the landscape over and over and over again, and you look at how the weather that you give it and the fuel layers that are available on that landscape tend to lead to certain areas getting burned more than others. It's a way to model probability of burning. Flores really is just simulating a single trajectory of what we consider, and I'm going to put in quotes, reality. So we're wanting to say for any given time step, this is where the successional signal has gotten us to, and that has consequences for the fuel that's available. Now let's look at what a real fire season might look like in that context at that year, after that much forest aging and the climate changing in certain ways. Something might burn, and then you keep going. So it's really a single trajectory of a forecast is the way to say it. And because of that, you need to run it multiple times to understand how the signal that you're observing varies depending on random stochasticity. So as Kelsey pointed out, stochasticity randomness comes into Flores in several different places, including where the fires ignite, the potentially the way in which the fire is responding to weather. And so it is important to get some boundaries on what you observe. So it doesn't estimate the probability of a single location burning, which is kind of an important point. It really will tell you at the scale of your study area, how has the fire regime changed with respect to what you've done in terms of management or in terms of what weather model you input and so on. So maybe next slide. I think we're more or less wrapping up here. There's some pictures of some caribou. And yeah, I think maybe we can go back to the demo if you think it's ready, Kelsey, but we're also now ready to sort of conclude and take questions. You're muted, Kelsey, if you're speaking.
All right, sounds good. All right, so yeah, I did finish. On the right here, you can see that it has been running. It'll tell you the Pandora time step that it's on. In the case of this first one, there were no fires, so it just went straight to the second one. While it's running the fires, it also lets you know, and it will let you know when it's successful and it's done, and it will move on to the next one. In this case, it has made it through all 5 Pandora years, and it is now moving on to the next land this year, but we do not need to watch it for the entire 50 years because that is going to take a while to run. So I will leave it there. I mean, yeah, we can take any questions at this point.
Guys. The Q&A is enabled if anybody would like to ask a text-based question. I'm also enabling everyone's mics and cameras if you'd like to be bold and ask with your voice. I'm more of a text-based guy myself, but I've also turned on the anonymous Q&A option. If the Q&A function's not working for you for some reason, don't hesitate to put it in the chat. I can read it for you from there. And while you're collecting your thoughts to ask your big, beautiful questions, I'm just curious, how many collared caribou were those data from that got pulled into the log regression for your RSF?
Good question. Kelsey, do you remember how many?
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head.
It's putting you right on the spot.
I
Yeah.
don't remember off the top of my head. It's written in the methods, but I can't remember right now off the top of my head.
It's definitely several years of data, almost 2
Yeah.
decades of data.
Yeah.
but the number of callers, I think it's, honestly, I just don't remember. It's 40 maybe, something like that.
Okay, yeah.
Don't take my word for it though.
Well, I guess is good.
Yeah. It's not hundreds.
Well, decades of data is still pretty solid indicator.
Yeah, I think they're daily fixes. So it's not really a high resolution data set where we're asking about movement at the scale of a road or something, but it's really good data for understanding over a season where they're spending their time with respect to where they could have spent their time.
Awesome. And I'm glad you were able to get your computer working.
Yeah, me too.
I see Erin has a hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I had to step out for a few minutes, so forgive me if you already answered this, but what are your next steps with this system?
So the next steps with this system are to finish all our own runs and get those papers out. And then it is to roll this out on a wider scale, which will involve some like beta testing and make it a publicly available application. So that'll be coming in the next while here after we finish wrapping up all the papers and stuff with our own application of it.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's just to sort of say again, there's a couple different directions we're interested in. One, as Kelsey said, is to answer some specific internal questions that are related to the forestry and ecology that we're interested in, but also to expand this out to different areas, different users, different forest management areas, and ask about the effects of regional differences on these processes. And so, and ideally, as Kelsey said, try to get some other people using it. That'll be quite revealing for for the development, we think.
Any follow-up questions there? Did I answer it for you?
Yeah, that's great, thanks. I think it sounds like something that would be really useful for, like you said, public access management and that sort of thing. Thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we have this sense that because of our own sort of research goals, we've we've sort of developed it in a way that it will be very useful for some things and not others. And so getting other people using it will be very helpful in knowing what sort of things to debug to ensure that it's a general tool, which is really the ultimate goal for these kind of trade-off decision management questions.
Other questions? We're a smaller group today, so there's still good odds if you have a question in mind, someone else is wondering too.
I guess I don't know if it's appropriate, but I have a question for you, May, and for the group. Does this group typically discuss or hear presentations on analytical tools, this kind of thing, or does it tend to be more sort of research specific or applied management specific?
Yeah, good question. Kind of runs the gamut. So our next Lunch and Learn webinar, May 12th, is about a commercial thinning operation to benefit community land and ungulates. And then May 19th, to be confirmed, we're hearing about an ecosystem services gradient. So we've kind of heard the gamut. When we talk about ecosystem restoration, it's that really wide net in the sense of the UN decade on ecosystem restoration. So it's Jane teaching about RSF at the college, but also Joanne moving dirty dirt to the landfill, and Barbara working on finding an alternative harvest model that will meet her end use objectives. So it's kind of all of it.
Yeah, that's cool. Are there many students involved in the group or that have presented?
We had 20% self-identified demographic of students and emerging professionals at our fall workshop. We have not had any students present. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I think one of the benefits of the community of practice is that we can all learn with and from one another. But whether you've been doing this stuff for 5 minutes or 30 years, there's still quite a bit that you have to teach. Particularly in this field, I think the Kruger-Dunning or Dunning-Kruger effect, that imposter syndrome is very active for a lot of people, but it doesn't matter how long you've been doing it, how much you know or think you know, you still have something to teach the rest of us. Michelle has asked a question in the Q&A. Thank you for the presentation. There is a focus on managing wildfires and caribou populations in Alberta. Do you also work closely with researchers and practitioners in BC?
Thanks for the question, Michelle. We certainly have much more connection with Alberta. One of the sort of categories of collaboration that happens quite often for this kind of stuff is with the forest sector. So we're working to some extent with forest companies in Alberta. We have colleagues in BC. Of course, the Canadian Forest Service has an office in BC, and they are doing similar work to this, and we connect with them occasionally. We do have opportunities to the sort of short answer is that we would like to use what we're doing here in places in BC, and we have a bit of an opportunity to do that in the interior with Parks Canada. But I guess the other short version of the answer is we not directly. No, we haven't connected specifically with anyone to do this in BC. We would certainly like to, though.
Hint, hint, nudge, nudge.
Yeah, I mean the variety of landscapes in BC is really interesting to us. So, as we were pointing out, the work we're doing is in the west central part of Alberta. So it's got this really neat interface between the boreal plain and the central mixed wood highlands. So there's foothills and really timber heavy boreal areas. And so we are quite curious actually about the effect of running this kind of model in a very montane area where you have serious constraints due to the mountains versus areas, for example, in northeastern BC where you have large flat boreal areas with a lot of wetlands. All of these different regional differences need to be we need to get a handle on them in order to make the tool more general. So BC, there's a lot of opportunity there. A lot of data wrangling required as well.
Looking forward to that. Hopefully some folks on the call can be involved. Michelle has said love to follow up with you. And Neil in the chat has asked, is there any plan to develop a graphical user interface? Maybe for the public tool?
Yes, that is something we would love to do. It is on the list of things to do.
It's a very long list.
Yes.
I could totally see the applications for, restoration planning and actions, and maybe helping us shift to being a little bit more proactive and moving beyond land use plans. In BC, of course, there's been a couple of new reports and recommendations that have crossed some people's desks recently. The From Crisis to Care report that we've shared on our collaborative Slack channel is one the Provincial Forestry Advisory Council just put out in early February. So I definitely see, some applications and alignment among these various initiatives going on.
And I will say that while it isn't a graphical user interface yet, which, like I said, that is definitely a goal. We would love for it to be. In coding it, I did try to make it as like user friendly as possible, and that like all the variables that need to be changed are at the top. They're not like randomly scattered throughout the code. Like the pieces you need to look at are in one spot, and where you need to change things is in one spot. And like I did try to keep it user friendly while I was coding.
Just waiting for the Python people to speak up. But
Sorry, that From Crisis to Care report, is that a Government of BC report?
it's the Provincial Forestry Advisory Council.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just asking what other questions were out there. What were you saying here?
I just wanted to respond to what you were saying there. You can tell, everyone I'm sure can tell from our presentation, that we have a forestry focus and forestry and caribou focus, and that in a way has made the development, I'll say easy. It hasn't been easy, but fire and forestry have these sort of, you can sort of think of them in the same scales, and so the connecting them is not too counterintuitive. But we would really like to be able to develop the forest further so that smaller scales, that where you are talking, for example, about linear feature restoration or other kinds of downstream restoration like wetland restoration, can be included as well. But it will be quite a serious uh, thing to do that, because yeah, it sort of implies different scales of the processes are operating at different scales. So I mean, I guess just stay tuned. We're keen to dig into those things.
Yeah, maybe with the further paradigm shift towards this nature strategy at the federal level, there'll be increased support for broadening and deepening these tools.
Yeah, agreed. That's a good point. New directions coming.
Yeah, but hearing no other questions, maybe we can close there on that cautiously optimistic note. I will put a link in the chat where you can see all the webinars, including the last two that are currently on the books for this spring. Eric and Kelsey, thank you again so very, very much for taking time to share some of this exciting work. It's great to know there are more tools in our toolbox than we realized, and even more down the road.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, everybody who joined, thanks for spending your lunch learning together. I'll see you next time.